Welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. Tim, Michael, Mo, and the occasional guest discussing digital analytics issues of the day. Find them on Facebook at facebook.com/analytics hour and their website analyticshour.io. And now, the Digital Analytics Power Hour.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. This is episode 120. Warning, this show is going to get really fucking scientific. If you were looking for our regular humor and banter, do not listen. They tell me we're going to talk about something called causal interference. What is causal interference, you might ask? Well, apparently, you might be just minding your own business, running an A/B test, which is totally scientific of you, and you could be confounded by some sort of statistical elves or something. So your test may be invalidated by the causal interference of these elves. They might find your test in what we call the statistical realm and just mess with it just to ruin your day. Hey, Tim, you're something of an expert on these elves, are you not?
Well, Michael, I think it's actually causal.
Just before you get going. Okay, yep. Mo, have you ever had causal interference mess with your tests?
I kind of think Tim's right on this one.
Okay, hold on, Mo. I'm getting something. What's that? No, they're not elves. Oh, it's not. It's causal inference, not causal interference. Well, what am I supposed to do? We're not prepared for that. Hey, Bradley, do you think you could cover causal inference instead?
Yeah, I think I can cover that.
Okay, cool. Okay, Bradley Fay is Senior Manager of Analytics at DraftKings. He's also held data science roles at other companies like Wayfair. He has his PhD in marketing from Arizona State University, and he is our guest to talk about causal inference. Welcome to the show, Bradley.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Okay. Woof, we dodged a bullet there. I'm so glad you could cover both of those topics equally.
A man of many talents.
Anyway, so maybe it can be confusing off the top, but I think that's why you're here. So maybe just give us a really quick overview of causal inference and sort of, let's get started in the conversation. And then, Tim, I'm sure you'll help take it from there.
Yeah, so causal inference it's basically the process of going through and trying to establish some sort of causal relationship, right? So we want to know if we move lever A, like how much does that actually change outcome B? And there's a lot of techniques and logic and reasoning that goes behind it, and causal inference is basically what captures all of that and helps us really kind of establish that these relationships exist.
So A/B testing in the case of a website. Definitely, that's kind of the case of very, very hard to A/B test in media, but it sounds like from that even just doing a straight up simple split test on a website, causal inference kind of comes into play or can come into play there as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole reason why you run an A/B test, right? Is because you're trying to establish that, like, if by changing some aspect of a website, right? So if you change your button color from red to blue, that you can establish like a meaningful, like, and persistent change in your outcome, whether it be like conversions or clicks or visits or whatever it is, right? So like A/B test is just like a very narrow type of causal inference.
But so why the term inference on the end?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it's one of those, like, the real challenge is, like, you can never establish true causality, right? Like, you can't prove truth. And so the best you can do is actually just infer it through like some sort of like logical deduction, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the reason why you have the inference in there is to kind of say it's not quite true, but it's the best we can assume under all the right conditions.
So when you're talking to stakeholders, do you say causal inference? Or
no?
Okay, so I guess
not at all.
That's why you speak at it's data science conferences. You get to say causal inference, right?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds fancy when you talk to stakeholders, right? So if you want to like say whatever you're doing is like really cool, you can say causal inference. But no, I think whatever we're talking about with stakeholders, you're trying to say, where it's most important you like try and frame it in the question you're trying to help them answer, and we're really just trying to say we're trying to help you answer the question of, if you move or make a specific decision, like, here's how much improvement or how much like cost we expect to happen as a result of that improvement, right? So like an example is if I change my bid on Facebook as I'm bidding for advertising, like I want to have some idea of like exactly how much more I'm going to spend, exactly how many more clicks I'm going to get, because like that sensitivity is going to tell you how much you should actually change your bid, right? Like you don't want to just willy-nilly just say like, oh, well, going to pay a $3 CPA and then like, it seems reasonable to pay 10. Like that's kind of unfounded. We want to make sure that we can like establish like why do we want to pay 10.
But so there's the whole, I mean, it's interesting you say Facebook or take Facebook or Google, the big media players, which are both kind of coming out and saying, just kind of tell us what you want, tell us who you want to target, set it up right, and we will kind of auto-optimize with the magic of machine learning. Discuss.
So like machine learning is great and like optimization is good, but at the end of the day, like they're trying to hit a target under a bunch of constraints, and that's not necessarily what as a business you want to do, right? So the way I like to frame it is like they have machinery that works in a certain way, and like it's black boxy to a point, and we don't have any control over that. What we do have control over is the like decision of what that target bid is. And like marketing, as you guys are familiar, like no one really knows exactly how much marketing's worth, right? Attribution modeling is like a super hand wavy thing.
Yep.
So what we want to get at is like, can you do a little bit of this, right? Like, can you get at building a better model or building a better mousetrap to set that bid so you don't have to rely on third parties, right? Like they're going to do what they're going to do, but you don't want to like rely on them to do everything. Like the set it and forget it. At least that's my mentality. Is like set it and forget it for like some sites is a little bit scary because things change over time and your goals change over time. And those algos don't necessarily update how they should.
So with causal inference, you're actually, because there's inference happening, you're trying to get to some deeper understanding of the cause. Like there's actual learning there, as opposed to if it's just machine learning or it's some neural network that's just cranking away there. Which, I mean, the knock against the deep learning and neural networks is, nobody knows the what and the why. It is completely black boxy. So causal inference, sort of with that mindset, it sort of forces you to have some thinking up front and then making sure that you're doing kind of a design of an experiment, and that might not be the right term, to actually say, does it seem likely that this hypothesis that I have is holding up? Like,
I mean, so the way I think about it is like machine learning and neural nets and all that stuff is really what they're trying to do is fit a statistical distribution, right? So the outcome variable follows some random distribution, right? So like if you're trying to classify pictures of dogs or cats, like it's a binomial, right? Like some probability that it's a dog and some probability that it's a cat. And it's trying to use data to just do that. It doesn't really care why it's a dog or why it's a cat. It just wants to make that prediction. When we're getting into causal inference, the real thing we're trying to answer is like, why? Like, why is this outcome change whenever we turn, some knob up? And so what it really takes, I think, is this is where like they talk about content area experts. Like it takes contextual knowledge to really understand, like, or even theorize, like, what are these possible relationships that like could cause, right? So like we know it's pretty reasonable that if I change my bid on an ad platform, like if I increase it, I should see an increase in spend, right? Like I should also see a corresponding increase in clicks. Like those are pretty easy. Where it gets like kind of a little bit nuanced or where you want a little bit more content area knowledge is like when I start to change things on a website, why do I think that should cause that outcome? And then like, can we actually go through and establish that does? Like, did that process actually changes our conversion rate or whatever it may be that we're concerned about?
I keep going through Daniel Kahneman's book again, which I know I've talked about a lot recently, but he goes on and on and on. And he says this quote like 1,000 times in it, all you see is all there is, right? And I'm thinking about this in this context because what worries me is how could you're trying to think of all the causes for some particular uplift in something because you've changed a particular knob or a button here or there. I suppose what I'm trying to think about is how can you be sure that is actually causing, or what you think is causing it is, do you know what I'm trying to say?
Oh, I totally get it, right? Like you're trying to say like, there's a bunch of moving parts and a bunch of reasons why like performance could increase or decrease, right? There's macro level factors, there's micro level factors. It could just be that like the person that sees the ad has a good day or had a bad day, right? Like they just like all of a sudden like puppies all of a sudden are just more friendly to them. I think the challenge is like you need to like understand and have those in your mind. But that's where like when you start running regressions and stuff like that, like you just like all that stuff falls in the error term. And this is where like the whole of causal inference is about how do you deal with these unknowns and unobserved variables and things like that. Like, is there a way to actually establish like what parts can we observe? And given that can we observe them, are we comfortable saying at least a portion of this is causal?
So as I've been sort of talking a lot about an analyst sort of transitioning and doing some aspects of data science, and the Venn diagram that I use the most often, it says, of what is data science, and it's one bubble is either statistics or modeling, whatever you want to call that. And then there's kind of a programming or computer science piece. And then the third part is domain expertise or subject matter expertise. I wind up usually, if I'm speaking at a marketing or analytics conference, saying, look, we have this. Like, this is the stuff that if you've been doing digital marketing for 5 or 10 years, you've got a lot of subject matter expertise. And then I kind of move on. Whereas if I understood what you were saying, it's like, well, no, bring that back up, because this is really the reason that you have to think really hard. I mean, I'll say if somebody comes straight out of school and they're a data scientist, chances are they have the programming, the computer science, the statistics, the modeling, but they can't possibly have real depth of knowledge in, marketing or financial services or manufacturing or whatever it is that is not taught. And that's the third kind of leg of the stool.
Yeah, I think that aspect gets underrated. I think in data science, the belief is like, if you can fit a machine learning model, you can solve a lot. And like you can to a point, but the real power comes in understanding the context in which you're working in, right? Like, so like you guys have been in marketing for a long time. And like, obviously like I spent a lot of time studying it. Like I still don't feel like I'm necessarily an expert in marketing. There's a ton of consumer behavior and different aspects to like that go into understanding how people make choices. And at the end of the day, like you can only explain so much, because as much as we'd love for there to be like this perfect model to predict, like if I, serve this person an ad at this point in time, it's totally going to create a conversion. Like it's not true. Like people are just generally weird. It's like super unpredictable. Like it's like, it's kind of funny. Like I'll sit in a room and I'm supposed to be the analytic or the quant guy. And I have to sit in there and say like, no, like people are weird. There's a limitation on how much we can actually do. And let's just be a little bit rational about this. But that's where like the content area I think comes in, and it's easy to like assume that it makes sense to people. But I think that's a strong assumption, and it oftentimes breaks down.
Dr. Peter Fader, who I totally love, who's been on the show before, has a quote, which I often come back to, which is that you need to embrace the randomness of customer behavior, because, like there is some weird customer that's going to check the status of his order 180 times in one day. And it doesn't matter how much analysis you do, there is something crazy going on there that you're never going to be able to explain.
Well, but it also, that even in both fronts, we've talked about this before as well, kind of the data literacies, the wanting the truth. And Bradley, you sort of set it up at the beginning. Like you're never it's inference, because you're never going to prove the truth. You're going to have a probability of something. And even that, because we're talking about consumers, it's not going to apply to every one of them, right? To your point, that you're talking about populations and saying that they generally will behave this way, but that doesn't mean there won't be many exceptions to the rule. And that, I guess, gets to, you dropped in the error term a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
And actually I just got a lecture about, well, that's what your error term is I was like, okay. It was in my equation, but I wasn't real sure what it was. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I'm going to touch on the population level, and then I'll get back to there.
Okay.
Right? So like, so the notion of looking at lift at the population level, like the reason why we have to do inference at that is because people are generally weird, right? And like we're looking for like on average. And I think that's often lost whenever people do like A/B tests or any kind of online experiments is what you're really solving for is like, what's the population average? There's like, you can get into more specific of like how much did I affect person A or person B, but that's one where you can never observe the truth. So it makes it really, really hard. But then how that kind of like rolls into the error term is whenever you run a regression. So how I was taught from like an econometric standpoint is like you have your observed and unobserved variables, and you work when you fit a regression under the assumption that whatever you can observe, so whatever your X variables are, if you could be an omniscient econometrician, they always say like unobserved to the econometrician, that like you could actually put in all of the other variables you need to where you essentially have a deterministic equation. But the reality is like you can't, right? So you don't know what someone's emotions are on a given day. You don't know what the weather is necessarily, like somewhere halfway across the world. I guess you can figure it out, but like those things, like they just explain such a small part of the variance that it's like it's not even worth the effort, right? So you just kind of assume that away, and you just say, cool, like the unexplained part of the variable that I'm trying to predict, like that's just the error. But that error is composed of all of the things that I can't observe and all of these like complex processes that are going on.
So error and noise are those cousins?
Sort of. So it depends. I think it depends on like the school you come from. So from from my training, the belief is that there is no noise if you have perfect information. There's no such thing as noise. I think it's like if you just accept that there's not perfect information, then you can kind of write it off to noise.
Okay.
So what is your training then?
So my background was in marketing, but it's really like a hybrid of psychology and economics.
Okay. And the belief is that you never have perfect information. I feel like that's somewhat liberating.
If you can accept it, yeah.
Yeah, but it requires you to kind of like grab onto that uncertainty a little bit and just be willing to ride it and know that kind of like the stuff you're doing is not precise or not necessarily perfect.
Yeah, right. Like it's getting away from deterministic modeling, right? Like I cannot perfectly predict any outcome. Like that's just how I kind of approach everything. And that's like super freeing because then it's just like, well, how close can I get within reason?
Yeah.
Which in AB, maybe back to AB testing, and I had this epiphany 6 months or so ago that when you run an AB test, your sample is for the period of time that you have an A and a B. You're trying to predict the future. The farther into the future you go, the more of the variables that are not accounted, like the more things will have changed. You know, the economy, competitors, the season, all that other stuff. So I feel like the CRO world is getting better at, like many things in digital, realize they sort of oversold themselves as being perfect. I mean, Optimizely kind of is the captains of that, right? They came out and they said, look, just run an A/B test. Everything's, it's perfect. It removes all uncertainty. It's unbiased. It tells you everything. And then they've kind of been slowly backtracking for 8 years and saying, well, but this and but that. And I think the side is that that's great. We can't run A/B tests many, 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 many times. To me, my understanding from when I saw your talk was, well, yeah, that's because A/B testing is just kind of one kind of narrow view, but you have these other things. And if you take this mindset of how am I trying to figure out what's going on, it gets a lot broader, but then it also comes back to A/B testing.
So I think the way to think about A/B testing is like when you run an experiment, you're doing that to generate data to then analyze, right? So whenever you're doing like the whole crux of causal inference is this notion of like the counterfactual. And so really what you're saying is like, here's the truth, right? Or here's my hypothesis is that if I change this button to green, I think I'll see this outcome. Well, what you really have to be able to observe to establish that that's true is what would have happened had I not actually changed the button to green, right? So like, what's the counterfactual in that situation? And so A/B testing is just a way to get at a counterfactual, right? Like we can say my hypothesis is changing the button or serving an ad or whatever it is. Like the only reason you need an A/B test is to generate the data. But if there's other ways to establish like what that alternative is, like if there's other data where it like already exists, then like you don't actually need an A/B test. There's other techniques that you can use to get there.
So I actually want to touch on that because I had this exact situation where we ran an A/B test. I think it ended up being like 6 months. And the only reason we kept running it because basically people were like, what if the variant doesn't continue to outperform the control? And we'll only know that if we keep a control so that we can continue to compare them. So I'm interested to hear how you would tackle that.
And that seems super expensive, like super expensive, especially if you have like a big effect, right? Like, if the test condition has like a substantial, like a meaningful lift over the control, and you believe that, like you make some assumption that, okay, I observe this in this one period, like, and I think it's reasonable that it'll continue through. Like the longer you keep that control, the more money you're leaving on the table, and like that's a super expensive. It's like a really hidden cost, but becomes a really really expensive test.
Well, but isn't that, and this is going to get me in trouble, if not with you, then certainly with Matt Gershoff, but the idea of a multi-arm bandit would be that you would say, well, I'll kind of keep my control, but I'll scale it way down so that I'll kind of shift my traffic so that I'm kind of keeping it running in case, and it can kind of bubble its way back up. But it seems like the bandit's approach are inherently saying maybe we're not really trying to figure out why. We really are trying to just make sure we've got things kind of monitoring on an ongoing basis and kind of shifting the traffic allocation to what seems to be performing better.
Yeah, I mean, the bandit's really like the whole design in the multi-arm bandit is about like making experiments cost less. So the multi-arm bandit is right. Like the canonical example is if I go to a slot machine, how do I figure out which slot machine is going to pay out more? Like the A/B testing framework would say, let's go spin each one 1,000 times and figure out what my EV on each slot machine is if I spin each one 1,000 times. The multi-arm bandit is just an algorithm such that like it's really expensive to spin losing slot machines 1,000 times. And if you can learn that faster, you want to get there faster, right? So multi-arm bandits are like actually like super efficient in terms of learning as fast as possible. And like the whole idea is like, let's just minimize the amount of time that we're running the suboptimal choice.
Got it. So I want to go back. We dropped counterfactual. So you just dropped EV, which was expected value.
Yeah.
It took me, so counterfactual, and I think the potential outcomes kind of or cousins. Can we define counterfactual? I had to sort of see that in a diagram before I really understood what the counterfactual. It's kind of like one of those where it's a fancy word and it's a little, I think, twisted as to what it's actually saying. Can you define counterfactual?
I'll give it a whirl. So a counterfactual, I think the best way to define it is the alternative of a positive statement, right? So if I'm going to make a statement of truth that like, let's put it in the context of web analytics, right? Like if changing the button to green is good, right? Like, so the counterfactual, you would have to state it as, what is the alternative to that? Like, so what is the mutually exclusive and incomprehensive, like, other set of that? So it would be, well, what would the world look like had that button not turned to green? Right. So it's all about like thinking about like, what is the alternative outcome? But that alternative outcome, essentially, like you have the set of all possible. And if you set it up correctly, it essentially like divides the world into two paths, right? One, when you make a decision, and then the other one, when you make the opposite of that decision.
And a lot of that, I feel like the reading I've done on it has come kind of from social sciences. When we think about it, A/B testing, you're like, well, we can kind of at least sort of see both of them, but in many, many cases, we can't. We have to make a decision. We've got historical observed data that we didn't necessarily have control over. So put it purely in just like I'm analyzing the website, find opportunities for me to improve my website, setting A/B testing aside, we wind up saying, well, wow, it seems like more people are falling off at this step in my checkout process than maybe I would have expected. But I don't have the kind of definitionally the counterfactual is not being observed. Like you have to, right? Like you can't have two split universes outside of the partial way that you have it in A/B testing.
Yeah, that's, and I think that's what makes the whole causal inference thing challenging, is because you don't necessarily have a counterfactual. So there's situations in which like you run an A/B test and you do that to generate the counterfactual, like that alternative. There's other situations where you have like, let's say you roll out a product feature and there's just doesn't make sense for you to roll it out to like half the population or parts of the population. In that situation, you don't actually have like data that represents the counterfactual. So then you have to get into like more sophisticated techniques that allow you to generate data or to do some sort of analysis where you can like logically establish that like this pattern happened, or this pattern would have happened had we not done this. And that's like kind of the art of, and there's some science behind it, but that's like kind of the art of causal inference. It's like figuring out like, how do you solve those like nuanced situations in which you can't run just a clean A/B test.
But the science is literally, and a lot of times we're working with time series data, but like for instance, you say, let me take the data up till I ran the change. Let me use that data to build a forecast of what I would expect. And then this is very crude, but then compare my actual results to what that forecast was. And then there are other ways to say, well, let me look at some variables that I don't think should have changed, and I can compare that. Again, I think diagrams worked a lot better. You had some nice diagrams in your presentation.
Thanks.
So that's kind of a pre-post, right? Like, I mean, we get asked to do a pre-post analysis, and it sounds like, yeah, causal inference plays a big role in that. There are a lot of techniques
Yeah, totally. But like the ability to generate that counterfactual comes down to how confident are you in that forecast, right? So like if you believe that forecast is 100% accurate of what would have happened had that like site-wide change not happened, then yeah, comparing like post versus like the forecasted of the pre, like that's a totally valid thing to do. Mm-hmm. So like in my talk, I talked about like correlation plus reasoning is causal inference. Like that reasoning, the like logical argument of like, can you actually establish that like that forecast is what I think would have happened had I not made that site-wide change? Like your ability to reason that is how strong of inference you can make in terms of causality.
No, we're never going to. But I want to ask, I'm going to give you an example of something. And then what I want to see is if you can sort of take that and say, okay, so to take that one step further, what you would like to do is maybe this. So as an analyst at one point in time, we were responsible for like optimizing and making updates to things on the website to make things work better. And it was a retail site, so we were selling products. So we built out a model that basically said, here's how people flow through the website in aggregate. So they come in, they look at products, they put stuff in their shopping cart, they check out. And then we would use that to drive our analysis to basically say, hey, if we incented or got people to stick their stuff in the shopping cart more, so like if we made the product page a better product page in some way, then we would then increase the overall, revenue and those kinds of things. And so we would do our analysis to then prioritize A/B tests against that. And so like sounds like kind of what you're talking about, because we would basically be making the assumption or making some kind of inference of, okay, we've got this activity. Let's say it's how many pictures we show of the product on the product page or something like that. So like that's our sort of null hypothesis is like by changing the number of pictures, we will get more people to put that product in their shopping cart. And then we'd run an A/B test on it, and then we would see if it worked or not. So then, okay, apply causal inference and say, okay, now to make that one step more sophisticated or better, what would you do from there?
Like the way you explain it is actually like fairly clean,
sure.
Right? Like, so you have your outcome variable you define, which is conversion rate or add to carts. Let's say add to carts. And then you said your hypothesis is like by changing the number of pictures, we believe that people will increase their add to carts, right? So, right. And then by putting in an A/B framework, you have you're creating two data sets. You're creating one data set in which the number of pictures has changed. And right. Then you have your other data set, which is where the number of pictures stay the same. Like that's your counterfactual. So I think like the only thing I would change is just like being very explicit about what your counterfactual statement is. And like, that's like a very academic thing to say, right? It doesn't change the power of the analysis. It just like makes it much more explicit of like what you're trying to do, right? Like we believe in this world that like changing the number of pictures of this. So we want to know like in an alternative world in which we don't change the pictures, like what would those outcomes be? But I think, so that's the thing is like, as long as the test is randomized and like, that there's, and this is like, I guess like stepping back a little bit, but as long as you know that the groups that you split on are identical in all ways outside of the treatment, then there's really not. And that's kind of the beauty of it is like, it's not hard if you can do certain things. It only gets hard is like when you can't randomize well, or you can't hold people out, or like time series kind of comes in and forces you to do pre-post. Like that's the only time when it gets complicated. The rest of it is just like, as long as you can establish that, the data set, your control is what the counterfactual would be, like you're good. It's like super nice. Like you can do t-tests. You don't even have to run regressions. You just run t-tests and it's amazing.
So that's helpful because I think walking into this episode, I'm kind of like, holy shit, everything I've ever thought about A/B testing has got some massive flaw to it. That I'm afraid to even touch that stuff anymore. And it's Tim's fault mostly because he's always talking about p-values and errors and all this stuff. And it's like, I get that there's uncertainty, but we still got to get stuff done. So like it's very helpful for you to describe it that way. So thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah. So sorry, Bradley, what in the circumstance where you can't A/B test? What are some of the other methods that you might turn to?
Yeah. Great question.
Which can I just like, if literally you said just rolling out, like if you roll out a product feature where it doesn't make sense to A/B test, I would think if I ran a campaign, we're going to run this campaign. We've never run this campaign before. It's going to be in multiple channels. Sorry, that not to sidetrack us off of the question, but it seems like every place where we're like, crap, I wish I could A/B test that falls under this.
Yeah. Yes. Right. Like that's a mutually exclusive set, right? Like you can either A/B test it or you have to do something else. So anything that like you can't A/B test falls into like, how do we generate that out? Right. So like, one way to do it is do geotesting, which is just like a variation of A/B testing.
But geotesting, doesn't that start to bring into you have to find two geos that you think are substantially similar. And so that's you're back to kind of what you were talking about, that you're
old test markets.
That's exactly right. So it becomes increasingly more challenging as you get away from A/B, because establishing the quality of that counterfactual comes down to like in geotesting, like how matched are your geos and like how well do those geos actually generalize to the general pop if you were to do that.
And especially in Australia, we did some geotesting, and it's actually really tough because we have such a small population. So trying to compare two cities is actually fairly difficult, or two areas within a city.
You just go door to door and ask people though, right? And you just kind of cover everybody.
Yeah. So this is where like there's like if you turn to like the academic research, there's some like cool methods of how do you hack around this. And so there's a couple of political scientists, and I'm gonna Abadi, I think is his last name, wrote a paper on like basically like the idea is like if you don't have a good geo, you can essentially like mash a bunch of them together to make them look like what you want to do. And if you believe that like that essentially like Frankenstein geo matches or serves as like a reasonable counterfactual, and you can do all the historic comparisons and things like that, then like cool, you just kind of make a forecast on like what that mishmash geo would look like going forward, and that like becomes a pretty strong argument, because it's instead of having to make the logical argument of why like Pittsburgh is like Cleveland or whatever it may be, like you could just say here's a super analytical solution of like these two things have been optimized to be as identical as possible on all of the things we care about, so it's reasonable that it serves as a counterfactual.
But at that point, in practical terms, now you're relying on whatever the channels are that you're executing through to actually, one, be on board and then able to actually execute based on whatever you set up, right? I mean, it's like Google could do a lot of things, but hey, you're running through your Google rep who may or may not actually, I mean, there are enough parties involved that are...
Yeah.
And if you're doing TV, then you're just completely screwed.
Yeah. So there's like other techniques for like TV and so like I used to work at Wayfair, and if you look on their tech blog, like I believe actually like they probably do it as good as anyone, but it's based on like they use like a signal processing method to generate their counterfactual, and they basically like try and forecast like what would visitors at the site have looked like had we not shown a TV ad in this 30-second spot, and then they try and quantify how big of a spike in visits to the site was it based on that counterfactual, and like it's a really solid method. I keep trying to convince them to write it up in a paper, but alas, no one wants to do that.
You got some secret sauce. You want to hold on to it.
But in a lot of these, I guess that in the case of Wayfair, they had scale, right? So counterfactual. So the other thing, one of our data scientists talks about the potential outcomes framework. Is that just when you say potential outcomes, the potential outcome is your counterfactual? It's either your...
Yeah. It's just like, if you want to say like the mathematical specification, it's just saying like, if my treatment is Y, then I believe it's this outcome. If my treatment is X, then I believe it's this outcome. And if like, depending on the number of treatments or the nature of your treatment, like it could be like the volume of your treatment, you basically use that to kind of like specify what all of the different outcomes are. And then, so all of your potential outcomes are aptly named. and then the challenge is like, how do you start collecting data on all those potential outcomes?
Okay. I think I'd probably sidetrack from Bo's question a little bit. We said kind of alternatives to A/B testing. We said geo being kind of a type of A/B testing. But then what are some of the, like, we'll hear regression as being like, gee, everybody understands it, basically has some intuition around it. We all learned the formula of a line when we were young. So does regression play in? Does it have its place? Is it just you can trip yourself up?
For what it's worth, I think regression's super underused. I mean, like, so the A/B test, the what do they sell it as? Like, basically, you run your A/B test, and then you can just run a t-test or a z-test or whatever it may be, and like get at it. And like that's your actual, and then the mean difference is your measure of true effect size. But the reality is like, this is where the error term comes in. There's a lot of other things that are correlated with like the difference in errors that gets kind of baked in there. And what we want to establish is like how much of the effect is actually due to the decision that we made. And so by running regression, you can essentially control for all of that observable correlation, right? So like any other thing that may shift the outcome, like you want to throw those into regressions just to hold them constant. You don't really care about like improving the predictability of the model. You're just trying to get rid of correlation. And that's where like I think regression like has a ton of value.
What do you mean you don't care about the predictiveness of the model? You're just trying to continue to find factors or variables that you're adding so you've got as much observed as possible?
So I'm going to use like a non-marketing example, but this is like a really common example in econ to teach this. So if I want to predict how much money someone's going to make over the course of their life, I really want to know how much, like one causal relationship that I could establish is like, how much more money am I going to make if I get an extra year of education or an extra 2 years of education?
Or let's say an MBA or a Master's of Data Science, just hypothetically.
Correct, right? Like, so how much more, right? Like, how much more am I going to make, right? Because the reason why you want to do that as a consumer is like, you want to do it because it's a positive ROI. Like you actually get a return on your investment. So you could collect data on a bunch of people who got different levels of education and a bunch of people who got different levels of income. But the problem is you're going to get these like weird relationships because you have things like professional athletes who get not that much education, but have huge salaries, right? And so if you can control for like the nature of the job, or you can control for just like natural ability, right? So let's say everybody gets an analytics job, right? And there's like variation in like the analytics salary. Like one thing you actually want to control for is like geography, because you're going to make more money in it's like San Francisco or Boston than you are in, I don't know, like Nashville, Tennessee, just for like cost of living adjustment. So you want to make sure you control for all that stuff. So you're actually getting it like how much does increasing education actually increase value? And so like regression allows you to hold those things constant and control for all of those. And so you actually get the true effect size and not get some weird bias in your answer to give you some misleading data.
And so then how would you use that in your next step of analysis?
So like whenever I like run an A/B test, like how do I throw regression in there? Or like how do I leverage regression?
Yeah. Yeah. How do they complement each other?
So I think it's one of those where like as an aside, I think you could run an A/B test and you could run just your general t-test and be done with it. But I think what you want to do is you want to take like, what are all of the other things that correlate with it, like conversions, right? So if, let's say we run a test over the course of 2 weeks and we change something on site and we want to look how conversion rate controls on site. Like one thing I think you would want to do is add like days of the week, because I'm assuming there's some natural like variation to conversions that are a function of it just being like the weekend or not the weekend that could impact the treatment. And so like, that's where I would go through and starting to do that analysis is saying like, what are all these other things that could affect the number of conversions we have and start controlling for those. So the only thing that we have left is like, how much did the treatment actually impact conversion? Because there also could be like some seasonality trend, right? Like if I run growth over time, or if I run some tests over time and there's like a bunch of other things that just change like general site performance outside of like my specific test, like confounding tests is not a fun thing. Then you want to make sure you can kind of control for those things. Okay.
So regression is starting to make a little more sense. You had also, when you spoke, talked about differences and instrumental variables. Can you take a crack at explaining those?
Yeah. So I'll start with difference because that's the easy one. Like looking at pre-post assessments, like that's effectively a difference in difference. Like in that case, you're saying like my counterfactual is the forecast and then my truth is like what happened. Difference is just like the regression form to analyze that. So it's not like super complex or anything like that, but it's the idea of there's two things and you want to control for whatever the difference was at the beginning of time and then whatever the difference was at the end of time. And if you subtract those two differences, like that's the true lift. And that just helps you from like overstating or understating any kind of like actual lift that occurred because of like effectively pre-test differences.
I've actually used that 1,000 times. I didn't know it had a name.
Yeah. And there's like super handy ways to get at in regression. So like if you just throw in like two terms of like pre-post as a dummy variable and then treatment or non-treatment as a dummy variable, and then the interaction term gives you the like true unbiased test. And like you don't have to do anything fancy. It just like works. It's pretty amazing.
To put it, if you had something that was trending steeply upward and you just said, oh, we're just going to look at the after and the before, even though it was already trending upward, you don't do anything to take out account that, no, what was the difference in the differences, not just what was the absolute difference. I don't know if that
No, you do. That's the whole thing. It's like you do, right? So if it's trending in an upward direction, you assume that it would continue to trend in the same upward slope if you hadn't introduced a treatment. And then all you're trying to measure is like, how much does that upward trend adjust either up or down? And then that's the actual effect of the treatment.
Got it.
All right. Excellent. All right. We do have to start to wrap up, but this is very fascinating, and maybe most fascinating for me because I started thinking I didn't know anything about this, but I've been using it all along. Awesome. All right.
As opposed to me, who's like, I need to go back and re-listen to this entire episode.
No, but Bradley, I think that's a testament to you making it really come through clearly. And so thank you on behalf of all of our listeners and me needing it in easier terms. That's really helpful. One thing we like to do on the show is go around the horn and do a last call. Bradley, you're our guest. Do you have a last call you want to share?
Yeah, I want to call out a book that I actually just finished reading called Prediction Machines. If you haven't read it, like highly recommend it. It's like the subtitle is The Simple Economics of Artificial Intelligence. And basically it's this book written by a couple academics at University of Toronto who work with the entrepreneurship, and they go through and talk about like what's the value of AI and what's the value of machine learning and predictions. And like they don't actually get into causal inference, so it's a little bit off brand, but I just found it like such a fascinating book. And I think like anybody who's managing data scientists or analytics who are wanting to get into like machine learning or any of this stuff, like you should definitely read this book because it puts into context of like what's the actual value that these things are driving for your company. And it like, I think that lens is needed so people don't just get like, I guess like drunk on like the possibility and are kind of stay grounded in reality of like, what are these things actually doing? And then what are the limitations?
Very nice. Very, very cool. That sounds like one I should pick up. Hey, Mo, what about you? Last call?
Yeah, I'm actually reading, I've just finished her first book and just started the second book, which actually came to me via my sister. It's an author called Emily Oyster, and she's an economist, but she writes about the most interesting topic ever, which is all to do with women's health through pregnancy and early childhood. And she uses like her economist brain to really challenge all of the myths that are out there. So she basically, when she started having a family, kept going to the doctor and they'd be like, oh, there's a really high probability of a risk of this if you do that. And she was like, okay, well, what's high? And no one could tell her. So she started doing all of her own research, has literally gone through every medical study that you can possibly find. And because she's an economist, has such a good way of framing the problem. And she's basically like, here's all the data on this topic. Now you make your own decision. And I just think it's really cool. So if you're a parent, I highly recommend having a read.
So she's like, yeah, you say this could happen, but what's the counterfactual? Does she use language like that in the book?
Oh, yeah. So the two books are Expecting Better and Crib Sheet. And yeah, she basically ended up circulating all of her research to her friends. And then eventually someone was like, you should put this in a book. And yeah, she's pretty awesome.
Nice.
Very nice. Okay, Tim, what about you?
Well, I'm going to do a book as well, but it's going to be very tangentially related because I literally just finished it on the airplane I was on a few hours ago. You guys know this guy, Simo Ahava?
Rings a bell.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he has not written a book, but this was courtesy of Robert Miller, one of Michael's and my coworkers. His sister is an author, a fiction author. So I just read Things That Fall from the Sky by Selja Ahava. Celia, I'm probably mispronouncing her name. I think it's the only book that's translated into English thus far.
That's pretty cool.
I mean, it's pure novel told from multiple points of views, kind of a little trippy, but there you go. Things That Fall from the Sky.
Obviously some genius in the family.
Very nice. So yeah, Simo, maybe write a book there.
What about you, Michael?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. I'm also reading a book right now, which I'm actually kind of enjoying. It's called Finish by John Acuff. It has nothing to do with analytics and everything to do with finishing things, which is something that I am not fond of doing. So, no, I think people's personalities go in a lot of different directions, and my personality definitely loves to dwell on the potential of things. And so a lot of times I find myself sort of dragging out any decisions or finalization for a while. And so I'm enjoying this book. All right. You've been listening and you've probably been thinking, oh, I've got something I want to say or talk about. as it pertains to causal inference and or casual interference, but most likely the first. We would love to hear from you. And the best way to do that is to reach out to us. That's through the Measure Slack or our LinkedIn group or on Twitter. We would love to hear from you, comment on the show, whatever you want to do. Also, if you're a regular listener of the show on whatever platform, if you wanted to rate the show and give it a review, that is something that apparently helps some algorithm somewhere do something causal to our rating and things like that.
We've actually gotten a few reasonably recently that were really nice. I was like, oh, well, that's nice.
Yeah, no, we always get really nice reviews, and we do appreciate all of them. So feel free to do that. Also, obviously, want to give a big shout out to the tremendous team on the show, because we have our engineer, Darren Young, and our producer, Josh Crowhurst, who are a huge help getting this show out there to you. And so we want everyone to know who all is making this happen. So once again, Bradley, thank you again for coming on the show, making some very keen statistical concepts much more accessible.
Hopefully it wasn't too confusing.
It was fantastic.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, very, very good. And I think I speak for my two co-hosts, Tim and Mo, when I tell all of you out there, now that you've got a little bit better understanding of causal inference, get out there and keep analyzing.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to join the conversation on Facebook, Twitter, or Measure Slack group. We welcome your comments and questions. Visit us on the web at analyticshour.io, facebook.com/analyticshour, or at analyticshour on Twitter.
So smart guys wanted to fit in, so they made up a term called analytics. Analytics don't work.
Analytics. Oh my God. What the fuck does that even mean?
Mo, if I'm gonna watch you moving your bike forward and back, you're
Dude, like, okay, this is my life right now. You know, I'm doing what I can.
Oh, editing is fun.
Your facial expression's not going to come through the audio.
Oh my God. Can we just scratch that whole thing?
For me, and I'm more of your average analyst as opposed to like Tim and Mo, but when you think about...
You're saying we're below average analysts? What? Did you just insult us?
Well, average. Come on, guys. Come on.
Every time you explain something, I understand it, and then Tim says something, and then I'm confused again.
So, you know. Is that what they call confounding? And, you know, working with Tim makes it feel like you don't know anything. So this has been really good. Yeah, I'm Tim. Yeah, here's their fancy words.
Really? Really?
Even prepping for the show, like there were all these formulas that don't have any numbers in them. That's really disconcerting. So, anyway.
Yeah, but then, Helps, you said it so much in the intro that then it was like burned in my memory, and I was like, don't say the wrong thing, don't say the wrong thing, don't say the wrong thing.
Trust me, I was doing the exact same thing. It was like, say it right, don't say it wrong. And then say it wrong, don't say it right.
When will we start seeing results, Michael? That's what I want to know.
Tim, this has actually all been ongoing work for many years, so you've already seen some pretty
That's
results.
Progress? Okay. Oh, frick of the frick.
So wait, you haven't finished the book? That's what you're telling me?
No, I have not finished the book. It's very unlikely that I will, too, though. I probably won't ever finish it.
The last 4 chapters are just blank pages anyway. The author is very self-aware.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah.
You had to tell me to think about my sentence, which I did.
Rock flag and casual interference.